What's going on, world? And welcome back to the Pursuit of the Good Life podcast, your favorite podcast that helps you grow both personally and professionally. I'm your host with the most, your favorite coach, the Kameron Lovelace, helping you create your version of the good life every single Thursday. What's going on, y'all? Y'all know we are continuing the conversation. It's still May in Mental Health Awareness Month. And so, let me ask you a question though, before we get into the topic. Have you ever been through a really tough time in your childhood experience, or heck, maybe even in your adult experience? Like it was a really, really tough time, whether it was physically, emotionally, mentally. Like, have you been through a tough time like that? And then like months, maybe even years later, like it's still affecting you. Like you chose to believe the lies of and the stigma of mental health that people who go see a therapist is crazy. Like you believe that lie and didn't go get that taken care of, but you're still feeling like the residual effects of it, and like you're experiencing different things physically, maybe emotionally, maybe you're constantly hyper, what we call hyper vigilant. You're constantly in a state of fight or flight, like you don't know when stuff is safe. You've been through it a lot. Yeah, you've been through a traumatic experience. Example of this is, let's say you're African American, and the summer of 2020, well, the spring and summer of 2020, when you saw Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, countless others affect your mental, and affect how you moved, and affect how, when you saw a police officer, it made you extremely uncomfortable, maybe to the point of tears. And that all is what we call in mental health trauma. Trauma is essentially, just to make it simple, not to get a Webster dictionary or anything, but trauma is basically the residual effects, the emotional, physical effects of a past event that has affected you long term once the event has passed and gone over. And so, one of the things about trauma is, this stat says that basically more than half of all, this is just Americans, have experienced some level of trauma, and that's probably severely on the low end. And the thing about it is, we've all been through, of course, we've all been through, rough times, trying times. But like when we go through that trauma, if we don't take the steps to recover from that trauma, then it can have lasting effects on us, um, physically, mentally, like the way that your brain develops. If you don't take the steps to correct it, it can affect you in just in how you move, how you interact with people, and eventually like your health. And so like I said, this particular month, I want to take the time to make mental health simple. So talking about trauma, I don't want to make it complicated. So I want to break this down into two different chewable ways that we kind of approach trauma. And so the first one is called ACE. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. It's a pretty good indicator, excuse me, of maybe some of the different issues or trauma that you've been through, and can kind of trace back to the different issues that you might be currently having. So basically, there was a study that was done to basically kind of get a measure of trauma within, like, commonly within all families. And so how they kind of categorize the different levels of trauma was to these three categories. It was abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Abuse, neglect, household dysfunction. Under abuse, of course, there is physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Neglect, there is the physical and emotional neglect. Household dysfunction, there are 5 of them. So you have somebody in the house who has mental illness, who has been incarcerated. Maybe you've seen the mom or one of your parents that was treated violently, so that you saw domestic violence. You have witnessed substance abuse or experienced substance abuse, or and you've seen divorce. These are all the different childhood adverse childhood experiences. And what we realized through this type of study is that children who go through these experiences, their cortisol levels are increased. Now, for cortisol, that is a hormone in your brain that can produce stress. So if your cortisol levels are way, way, way too high, that starts to adversely affect your brain. And so your score on a scale of 1 to 10 is based on the amount of experiences that you have experienced. So, for example, I'll go through me. For example, abuse. I never experienced physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. I never was physically neglected. I always had food on the table. I always had clothes on the table. Emotionally neglected. Emotionally neglected. I wasn't. Mental illness. I never knew anybody with mental illness. Neither of my parents were violent. I didn't see substance abuse. I didn't see incarcerated, but I did see divorce. My parents did get a divorce while I was a teenager. So my A score is particularly low. However, I have had clients that definitely have had 8, 9, some even 10 based on their experience. And so when you go, the higher your A score, the more likely that you will probably experience some form of physical physical ailments, so such as an asthma, um, high blood pressure, think like cardiovascular issues, different stuff like that, or you'll experience probably some form of mental illness. Because you remember when we talked about in week 1 that stress and anxiety usually comes from a buildup of certain experiences. Well, adverse child effects can lead to the same way. It can lead to not just anxiety, not just depression, but schizophrenia, but PTSD, which we'll get into that later, bipolar disorder, uh, personality disorders, OCD, a number of things. These can all lead to you having mental health issues just because the way that your brain has structured foundationally in your childhood can create those mental health issues in your life. So ACE can be a great foundational starting point for you who's wanting to learn more. Maybe I need to, you know what, before I go to therapy, let me see if there's anything that I specifically need to zero in on. Because once you get in that therapy chair or that therapy couch, they're definitely going to start uncovering some things in your childhood to see if it's affecting you now. So, ACE, childhood adverse childhood experiences. Quick Google search will give you all the information that you need, research wise, as far as that. Now, dealing with those issues, you're gonna need to sit in somebody's chair, go see a therapist, um, maybe do some personal work, right? So that's a good way to start framing, like as far as trauma. So the different experiences that you have experienced as a child that you've brought into adulthood, maybe that affect who you are today. That affect how you emotionally respond, how you physically respond. I know some who she went through so much trauma, she slept with a knife under her pillow for a long time. And she couldn't like fall asleep without it, like to be comfortable, because she felt like based on her upbringing and her childhood environment, she at any time she might need it. So different things like that are a result of your different traumatic experiences that you have gone through. So I want to challenge you to reflect, especially during Mental Health Awareness Month. I want you to become aware of maybe some things that you have been through that maybe you need to revisit and shine a light on and go back to the drawing board to deal with. And so, as I get my thing, so one of the things that you, you really want to pay attention to is developing long-term habits because of your traumatic experience. So, one of the more common mental health disorders, of course, is PTSD. PTSD is commonly associated with military personnel when they come back from war, and they just can't really function right because you were in a literal war zone, maybe hearing bombs, gunfire, um, going through it, and then you're coming back into civilian life, and different things are triggering for that person, or they can't sleep right, or they can't eat right, they can't function. It's hard for them to come back um into society because they functioned for however long they were in the war zone for the period of time that they did. And so that's the most commonly associated, but come to find out, it actually runs deeper than that. You don't have to go to the military to experience PTSD. PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, is defined by basically you have experienced a traumatic event that still affects you today. So, for example, I had a client who was a college student. This is when I was going through my internship, and her father used to physically abuse her and her mother, like physically, like bam. Actually, and the brother too. And so eventually, the dad stopped. He stopped hitting. Now, part of this is because he got older and obviously couldn't do as much, and then kids got bigger, and he just stopped. But the thing is, that foundational experience was still with this particular woman. And when she was coming to see me, like the thought of the memories, him getting this close to her, like coming in to hug her, would cause her to go into that fight or flight mode, hypervigilance, hyper to be aware, to like, I don't want you to like get off of me. Like she would become aggressive, and that is example of post-traumatic stress disorder in real life outside of the military. So some of you have been through a very traumatic, I won't even say event, but you've been through for an extended period of time, for months, maybe even years at a time, and that experience is still holding on with you, and your body and your mind is still feels like you're in the middle of it. So whether that is you've gone through a physical abuse with a partner, or through a parent, or you've seen somebody uh, experience that. This doesn't even have to happen to you. You can just be witnessing it and taking it in, and then have the fear and cortisol and all the things bubble up inside of you. Seeing somebody die in front of you. Some of us we've grown up on the wrong side of the tracks, and we've seen some things, and seeing somebody die in front of you, not everyone can bounce back from that, especially so quickly. Being cheated on in a relationship can affect you traumatically, especially if you stay in it. I had another client who, for whatever reason, his girlfriend cheated on him, and he didn't break up with her, but still allowed her, basically let the relationship evolve into an open relationship, and he wasn't okay with it. But he said he was like, I don't want to lose you, so go do what you do with him, and then just tell me when you do it. That was laying layers and layers of trauma on him, which was affecting how he moved and grooved with his next relationships. You get what I'm saying? So PTSD isn't always attributed to military. It can be attributed to the everyday man, the everyday woman, the everyday child who has lost a parent in a car accident. Hello, somebody. A child who has seen their mother in and out of jail, who has seen their uncle shoot up heroin and deteriorate slowly but surely. The thing about trauma is we're witnessing it, we're experiencing it, and like I've said before, our body and mind holds on to it because your body is going to go into a state of, you know, trying to regulate your stress, fight or flight, or escape the stress, doing what it does. Like that's how your body is relaxed because everybody responds to different circumstances in different ways. But your body is going to try to tell you to run, to get out of there, to avoid this stressful circumstances. But your you won't be able to. You get what I'm saying? And so sustaining that level of stress, cortisol, hypervigilance, fight or flight, staying in that mode for so long impacts your brain, impacts your heart, impacts your body to the point to where very, very bad things, asthma, what do we got here? Stroke, cancer, diabetes, all because of the experiences, not because of your diet, but because of the different traumatic experiences that we have been through. So that's why this is so important. And so we how so how do we deal with all this? So there are a number of ways, and we're still in the mental health field. We're still trying to figure out, you know, what's the best way to deal with trauma? How do we deal with that? Well, number one way to deal with it is definitely go to therapy. You know, normally I say, oh, well, you know, you gotta physically, you gotta mentally, you know, on the previous ones like depression, anxiety episodes. With trauma, you got to work with somebody professionally on this. Trust me on this. You got to work with somebody who knows what they're doing and knows how far to push the buttons, letting you experience certain things. Like for example, I used to do this thing called, well, with my clients that have done this, we did what's called a trauma narrative. And this is basically, it's going to sound crazy, but it works. It's basically where they relive the traumatic event. And the thing about it, the reasoning behind this particular intervention is basically to get their mind and their body used to reliving it all the time, like to get used to it because you have such a bad experience with it. And like you might start balling up, you might start tightening up, you might go in the fetal position. Like there's so many different things that you can do when revisiting those memories. And so doing the trauma narrative allows you to tell a story. You tell it at your own pace, and you get used to like the memory of it because it is, at the end of the day, a memory and not now. And it's also allowing you to go walk through it emotionally because us therapists, we're trained to help you be aware of your emotions and be able to decompress and deal with them, right? So different things like that. There's this therapy called EMDR. I'm not certified in it, but I know some of my therapist friends are, and it's like a gold standard when dealing with trauma. So EMDR certified therapists are definitely a good one. I So there's one called exposure therapy, which I don't know if I I wouldn't recommend that for the faint of heart because that is basically um it's basically where you kind of re-expose yourself to the traumatic event so that your body goes through the motions and you learn how to calm yourself down in the face of it. So let's say, for example, you got into a car accident, horse riding accident, boating accident, and now every time that you see the boat, think of water, think of a horse, think of a whatever, like you break down, like you just can't do it, like at all. Like it's just what you holding on to is so bad, like you're shaking. And so lightly exposing yourself to that particular event. So we would start by, we wouldn't jump to the horse, we wouldn't jump to the boat. We would start with, of course, reliving the event, and then slowly like bringing in like a boat, learning how to relax, and just moving up from there. So pictures of a boats, books of a boat, a smaller boat, boating videos, like different things like that. So that is exposure therapy. um Between therapists, that's kind of like it's like, why would you put your client through that? Well, it kind of works. I'm not gonna lie to you, the results, the research, it says it works. So it's kind of a thing. But um at the end of the day, when dealing with trauma, you definitely have to um talk with somebody professional about it, because what you don't do, and what a lot of people do, is they feel like when the trauma is attached to a person, they feel like they have to make peace with the person that caused the trauma. So let me say that again. Most people, if they get wronged by somebody, they feel like they have to go to that person, talk with them, and make peace with that person. No, 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 no. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. You don't need the other person to get to a peaceful place. That person, whether it was a toxic relationship, an abusive partner, an abusive parent, what else? And somebody who enabled you to do a bad habit, something that involved that person. You don't have to reconnect with that person to get peace. And then once you got peace, you still don't have to reconnect with that person. Like, you can leave them in the past and wish them well. So that's a common misconception when it comes to getting over traumatic experiences. You got to go back and reface your particular issues, and that's just not true. I have to line that out, is that you do not have to do that. You can go through this journey of self healing, the self love, whatever movement you aspire to. You can do this on your own. Well, not no no no. Let me back that up. You can't go through and unpack your trauma and deal with that on your own, but you don't have to revisit those people who caused the pain to do that. You don't have to. But trauma is serious, and many people experience trauma uh, throughout their life, from uh, early childhood to teenage. What am I looking for? Adult adolescence, to adulthood. We all experience it, and the earlier that you experience the trauma, probably the more likely it's going to affect you in adulthood. So it's important for you to be able to recognize trauma, and be able to recognize when it's affecting you, because you're gonna lose sleep, you're gonna constantly be stressed, you're going to worry about things, you might hear things that aren't really there, and you'll be in a constant state of, I keep using this word, hyper vigilance. That is basically when you are so uneasy and hyper aware, like you can't really relax. Your body's in a fight or flight mode. If you're feeling that, if you're experiencing that, if you know somebody that's experiencing that, advise them to find a therapist, and not just a psychiatrist who's going to give you a pill, say relax, and then call me in 2 weeks. No, 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 no. Trauma is something that you got to work with people until you can handle it. So it doesn't mean uh, 2 months and you're good. Doesn't mean 6 months and you're good. Sometimes it can take years for you to unpack the different trauma that you have been through and then be able to function like you want to. All right. So take your time with that, especially if you know somebody who's dealing with trauma. Have a little grace for them. Try to, obviously, if they're not comfortable, don't ask them what their trauma is, but try to have an understanding. Like, you don't know what people have been through and gotten them to the point that they have been. All right. So that is why we're talking about this, pursuing our version of the good life. You got to have the mental health in order to create that version of the good life. All right. So if you love this episode, do me a huge favor. The best way that you can support the podcast is to subscribe. Subscribe on YouTube and subscribe on iTunes. That's the best way to support the podcast. All right. So if you're listening to this on iTunes, go ahead and give me that 5-star review. Y'all know we only do 5 stars, nothing less. If you're watching this on YouTube, hold on, smash that like button, comment your favorite part of the podcast, and share this with somebody who really needs this. Same thing if you're watching this on Facebook. All right. So y'all know how we do. We're helping you create your version of the good life every single Thursday. Until then, we'll see you next week.